Hi, everybody. My name is Kavanaugh Kelly. People call me Cav, for those of you who don't know me. I teach in the School of Occupational Therapy. I'm an assistant professor there. What we're going to be talking about today with the lecture series is empathy, the idea of teaching empathy to healthcare students, in particular teaching empathy to healthcare students through narratives, literary narratives, or a certain kind of story that we're going to get into. The outline for today, we're going to talk about what empathy is, kind of a definition of empathy that is more kind of volition-based versus static inherited trait kind of based. Kind of a crisis in healthcare, the lack of empathy in healthcare, the power of empathy to improve health outcomes. It's really evidence-based, strong evidence showing that more empathic you are, the better outcomes you'll get with your patients. This idea of teaching through narratives. Why teach through narratives? Why teach empathy through narratives? And then kind of a comparison, case studies versus case stories or narratives. Are case stories a way to kind of deepen what we're teaching already, make us more impactful as instructors? And then the research I'm doing at Hudson around a particular class, around teaching empathy to healthcare students through narratives. Been doing that for like 3 years now. I'm going to look at the research and kind of the evidence around that. Okay, so this idea of what is empathy, I think if you ask 10 different people, you probably get 10 different responses in terms of what they think empathy is. We're going to look at it very broadly, holistically, as these kind of 4 components of it. Theory of mind, which is kind of cognitive empathy or mentalizing or trying to make an educated guess what you think somebody else is thinking. Emotional resonance, can you feel the emotion of this person as you're kind of interacting with them, trying to understand them? Emotional regulation, this is an important part of healthcare. We don't want to go too far and slip into that world of our patient. We want to kind of keep a barrier, a boundary to a degree. And this idea of empathic volition, looking at empathy as a willful act, something you do versus something you are, a verb versus kind of a noun, really. Here's kind of the factors of empathy. And I'll kind of rotate around this idea of empathy as an active process. I think it's important for the studies that I'm doing to see it this way, because maybe this is something we can teach, this active engagement versus just something you are or you are not. Here's an example. Definitely I teach through stories. We'll use stories today, kind of hit some of these concepts. The idea of empathy is something you do versus something you are. Robert Kirkland, for those of you who aren't familiar with the story, he was a Confederate soldier during the Civil War, during the Battle of Fredericksburg. Horrible battle, horrific battle. And during the battle, as a Confederate soldier, he was shooting and killing soldiers from the North. Definitely not empathic at that point. But there was a lull in the fighting, kind of between the two armies. There was kind of a no man's land where all these bodies kind of lay in this open field. And again, it was just kind of a horrific kind of scene, not to make it too graphic, but a lot of people losing blood, moaning in pain. He took it upon himself to go into this no man's land, risk his life, and provide water and any kind of comfort he could to these soldiers that were wounded and dying in this open field. At that point, he was being empathic. He was demonstrating empathy. He was engaging empathically. Other points, it was not. So during our lives, it's something we do. Points where we do it, and there's points where we don't do it. It's not just I'm born that way or I'm not born that way, at least in terms of a degree of it. Why do we care about empathy? I mean, it's nice, kind of concept, but what does it really matter in terms of healthcare? Empathy is commonly known as a spouse value of all healthcare clinicians. It's in the doctor's Hippocratic Oath. It's a code of ethics for nursing, pharmacy, PT, OT, counseling. Huge part of what OT is to be empathic, seeing everybody as an occupational being. It's a big part of who we are, at least who we think we are as healthcare providers or want to be as healthcare providers. But the reality is, as most of us are aware, a lot of clinicians, in cases you could almost say a majority of clinicians, are not acting as empathically as they potentially could be. A lot of evidence around this. 11-second visit. Recent studies have shown that you go into the doctor's office and you have on average 11 seconds to give your story. And I'll give you a pretty graphic modern example of why that is such a devastating thing to the patient and really the healthcare system as a whole. You have 11 seconds before the doctor interrupts, writes a prescription, sends you on to a specialist, moves on to the next person. Even other clinicians, when they survey patients, not therapists and nurses or pharmacists, but the actual patients, do they feel like they've been treated empathically by their nurses, by their OTs and PTs, their counselors, that sort of thing? They say no. There are a lot of cases they're not being treated empathically. The clinician, the therapists, for example, are more focused on discharge, meaning their gait, mobility, ADL goals, and keeping up the productivity, kind of meeting the needs of reimbursement in the institution versus the individual. Surveyed occupational therapists, over 600, I believe, stated that they don't feel like they were even trained in school to practice empathically in practice, that there's a huge disconnect. And as we all suspect, it's gotten even worse during COVID, less and less empathy. So it's something we espouse as a trait, as a valued trait, but it's not something we're doing. There's this huge disconnect between what we want to do, what we say we're going to do, and what we actually do. One researcher said occupational therapy in particular is experiencing an incongruence in values. We're not doing what we preach to be doing. Again, why do we care? The evidence between empathy and outcomes is overwhelming. I could give you a book that goes through 1,000 different research articles or research efforts that show that the more empathic you are, the better outcomes you get. The greater the empathy with a clinician, the better the outcome. Overwhelming evidence of that. Reduces visits, improves outcomes, reduces visits, reduces medical errors. This is very much around our need for productivity and reimbursement. Improves patient satisfaction, more client-centered, reduces clinician burnout. Can be done in a timely, efficient manner. Not only does it reduce visits and errors, which is time and money, but it can be done quickly. Studies have shown this very quickly, actually. Here's an example, story example. Actually, quite recent example. There was a young man who went into Mercy Hospital with a rash on his leg, flu-like symptoms, dizziness, lightheaded. The ER physician said, no real signs of Lyme disease. I'm going to give you something for your rash, send you home. He got sicker, came back. They did the same thing, send him home. Went to a second hospital, main medical center. They said, thinking you may have Lyme disease, actually listened to the patient, where he'd been, what he had been doing. Gave him a Lyme test. He was positive. Treated him with antibiotics. At this point, he had carditis, quite advanced carditis of his heart. It was too late. He passed away. Cost Mercy Hospital $6.5 million in a suit. Cost this patient their life, money, time, impact on, most importantly, impact on our patients. Lack of listening. Lack of taking in the story of our patients is costing our patients, costing our system a lot. The evidence, this is what one review of all the evidence said, the evidence supporting empathic-centered healthcare is as clear as hand washing. It's almost to the point where it's like they have an infection, viral infection, bacterial infection, and you withhold the antibiotic, you withhold the medicine. By not practicing empathically, you're not giving your patient a proven, valued intervention, modality, whatever you want to call it. So obviously we need to do a better job of teaching our clinicians to be empathic in practice. How do we go about doing that? Are narratives the way to go? Why go through narratives? Why teach through narratives or stories? Why teach empathy in particular through narratives? This idea that of teaching through narratives really kind of corresponds to how our students think, how we all think. We think in stories. We organize, conceptualize, make meaning of the world really through the stories. Where's the evidence behind this? Everywhere. What are you going to do tonight? You're going to go home and watch Netflix. You may watch the news, story about all these people. You may watch sports, story about the characters within the game. You may read, you may listen, you may talk, you may work on your own story on Facebook, the story that you've created about yourself. Check out the stories other people are creating about themselves. We make meaning of everything we do through stories. I'll give you a story about thinking in stories. There was a study that was done quite a while ago, 1915, 1916. It was like when they started getting animation. They were kind of fascinated with that. They wanted to see how people react to animation. So what they did is had a bunch of people, and they watched this very crude animation, which was a box, circle, and triangle. And basically, they just kind of moved around randomly. And they asked the people, what do you think of what you saw? Two of them said, there's nothing there. It's just random movements. The others in the study, I think it was over 20 people, said, oh, it's a story about my mother-in-law, how she's always interfering in our life. Oh, it's a story about this happened to me or that happened. They made stories out of random information. Information you're spewing out at them as your lecture. What is the student trying to do in his brain? He's trying to organize it into a story. That's how they think. That's how our mind works. Secondly, we learn through emotion. Amartya Yang, a famous neuroscientist studying the brain and education, she said, we feel, therefore we learn. Obviously, we remember what is emotional. We forget what is not emotional. So putting two and two together, story, emotional story, more than likely going to get that buy-in with our students versus organized facts, the didactic kind of lecture. Thirdly, we base decisions on the emotional stories of the past. How do we know this? Portraying names here, I'm not sure a lot of names. Kahneman and Tversky, they won the Nobel Prize, around the sociologists, psychologists around this whole idea of how do people make decisions? That's back in the 70s, late 60s, they want to figure out, how does this work with people? So they did a lot of really amazing and convincing studies. And they went to the top of the heap, so to speak, of people making decisions. Financial advisors, the people who are running our 401ks, what do they base their decisions on? The numbers, right? The spreadsheets, the trends of the stock market. What about their number people, the ultimate number people? What about surgeons? What about the ER physician faced with the crisis of the patient coming into their face? What do they base their decisions on? Certainly tests, biological tests, x-rays, MRIs, that's what they base their decisions on, right? Well, what they found was that that's not really the case. What people do, stockbrokers, doctors, they base their decisions on emotions and facts. And if you look at the brain, can't think of his name, but he's done a lot of research around the brain and how it works, very intertwined. The emotions centers and the cognitive thinking centers, cold decision, objective centers, they're intertwined. It's not one or the other, it's both together at the same time. Here's an example, a theoretical example from the Kahneman and Tversky research. Okay, so you have this man, it's 1939, going to Europe, 1939, in Belgium in particular. He's an older Jewish gentleman. He's heard of what's going on in Germany. He's aware. He's read about it. He's seen it from family and cousins in Germany. He knows what's the horror of what's going on with Hitler and Nazism. He's making logical guesses that the Germans are probably going to invade very shortly and come into Belgium, as they did during World War I. But he has something else in his mind, something else in his memory. The emotional story of the past. In this case, in particular, it was World War I. He lived through World War I. They survived through World War I. In his neighborhood, in his home, in this tight community where he knows everybody and they rely on each other. They came together. It was very, very hard. They came together. They survived. They got through it. Certainly, it can't be any worse than that, right? What is he going to do? Is he going to leave or is he going to stay? If you look at the Tversky and Kahneman kind of research, more than likely, he's going to stay. He doesn't know what really is going to happen. He just knows what did happen in the past. So again, our students are at that board exam, those exams, what are they basing their decisions on? The emotional impact, what they saw in the clinic, the emotional impact, theoretically, of those vivid stories of clinicians with patients that they experienced. The emotion. They're going to base their decisions on the emotion and the facts together. So why teach empathy through literary narratives? We know that our students think in stories. We think emotional stories are more effective than flat facts. Other evidence showing that narratives improve our ability to understand others of our factual accounts, particularly others with a differing perspective on the world. Could be a cultural difference, ethnic difference, minority, whatever you want to quantify it as. A story about that person compared to like a news account, a factual account, to, I dare say, a case study, it's a lot more effective. They're going to understand and empathize and see where that person is coming from to a higher degree than they are just from reading the facts, so to speak. A lot of research is showing that literary narratives improve cognitive levels of empathy, theory of mind. So reading a literary narrative, pre and post, your ability to theorize what other people are thinking improves through studies. Lots of studies. What do I mean by literary narratives? I mean, we could spend all our time just thinking about that. I brought, there's some examples. If you come to my office, I can give you some examples of that, some book examples. But generally speaking, these are stories that are kind of literary in nature. I'm not talking Shakespeare and Milton, kind of modern versions of that, complex, nuanced characters that may be flawed to some degree. They're very human-like language in terms of metaphor, sensory, that sort of thing. Nuanced meaning, ambivalent meaning, not clear-cut kind of meaning, not kind of fiction that's like a murder mystery or a romance novel, genre kind of fiction. Not that kind of fiction. Narratives also create these unique internal cognitive worlds. A lot of theorizing around that of what happens there. But this is kind of a whole different level than watching a movie or a documentary, not that they aren't good. But you have to create the world in your head, especially if it's literary, this detailed metaphoric world, create this really complex, full-dimensional character in your head, potentially very powerful stuff. And the evidence is starting to emerge that it is powerful stuff. That's why we're going with the narratives. That's why we're going with the literary narratives. Okay, so all that said, what do we do at Hassan? Design a class that's based mostly based on the narrative medicine program at Columbia University, where they teach through narratives. They teach future doctors, medical students through narratives as part of their whole medical school program. They have a program that goes all over the world now. They teach other healthcare clinicians. I went down there, did some training along with Greg Winston a few years back. So it's kind of based on that. What do the students do in my class? They obviously read literary narratives, novels, short stories, memoirs. Some are very brief, some are more longer. And they reflect, discuss, and kind of apply that to OT concepts, course standards, do kind of different activities around the stories, modified occupational profiles to get that full character description, something we call an OT world. Basically, seeing the character as this fully dimensional person. 3-story assignment, which again is based on OT concepts of narrative reasoning through Fleming and Mattingly's research, looking at the patient as a story, unfolding story. experiential applications, problem-based learning. Very traditional problem-based learning. You do that with problem-based learning. List the problems, measures, intervention, goals. We do that with stories. And we apply it to simulations. They're applying these concepts to patient actors and all that sort of stuff. I think it's very important to realize with this is not a separate medical humanities class that you take as an undergrad. This does not subvert or replace traditional content. This deepens and more impactfully addresses course standards. It's really aimed at course standards, and it really goes after those course standards at a much more deeper level than traditional kind of content. So we're not replacing anything. We're making what we're doing better. It's not really more time consuming. We're just kind of taking out the case studies in a lot of cases and putting in stories kind of thing. And this kind of is like the whole approach to everything I teach, but especially this class. The lecture is very story-based. What do I mean by that? We start with a story, and we kind of tease what's going to happen or what may happen or what could potentially happen, and then we kind of present the facts of the lecture, and we go back to the story, kind of finish the story, end the story. What do you think we need to do with this patient now? That this kind of dilemma kind of thing. Emphasizes something that's very important to OT, occupational therapy, therapeutic use of self through empathy, genuine dialogue, facilitating that with our clients. Really facilitates emotional intelligence. And the idea really with this is to kind of embrace emotion versus running away from emotion. I think a lot of instructors kind of run away from emotion. I think it kind of takes away from what they're trying to teach the students. I think it's really the exact opposite. It's more of a combining of the two. Healthcare is inherently emotional. We need to get our students ready for a lot of the sad, traumatic stories that they're going to be seeing, experiencing as clinicians. They can process their own emotions better. They can understand the emotions of the client that they're dealing with better. Very, very important skills in my mind. Deepen understanding of such things that are important in this class. I think probably a lot of programs, social determinants of health, cultural awareness, facilitating this idea of narrative reasoning, seeing patients as an unfolding story, and then again, traditional clinical reasoning, problem-based learning, very much a part of this as well. Again, it gets this idea into this concept of consilience, which is kind of the combining of art and science together, combining of kind of medical humanities and medical training. Again, we're not looking at these separate silos where they're kind of usually traditionally taught, oh, that's just general ed stuff. We need to kind of forget about that and really learn about the real way of being a clinician. No, I think it's the opposite. I think that may be part of the reasons why we're just not practicing with empathy in practice, combining the two in that sort of sense. Here's kind of a theoretical comparison based on a lot of research and material on case studies versus these stories or these narratives kind of thing. It kind of goes through the check boxes, the case studies, the videos. The case videos are very similar to the case studies. They're very popular now. Very effective tool. I use them. We use them in our program. Great tool. But they have obviously have limitations in terms of how deep they can go in understanding and impact on students' learning. They're not really person-based or really not narrative-based, emotionally engaging, diverse point of view. They may list things like this person is Hispanic or this person is African-American, but it's not really integrating it into a real-world, emotionally engaging narrative. They don't foster emotional empathy, intelligence, internal world making, all these things that we get at with the case story or narrative, literary narrative versus the case study. There's those of you who are just listening, there's an example that's also posted with this of a case story versus a case narrative. You can see the difference, and then there's a third option, which is the two kind of together, which I do a lot in my classes. So the research. Let's get to the research at Empathy, which I've done for the last 3 years and doing it again this year. Spring of 2020, this is the first study at Hudson. 31 students involved, mostly female, graduate level, high achieving kind of students. What did it find? We did 2 different surveys in this initial study. One was the Jefferson Empathy Scale. One was the Reading the Mind and the Eyes Test scale. We did these pre and post. The JES, I think, is the most important one in my mind because it correlates with practice. It's designed for healthcare clinicians, healthcare students, specifically designed for that. Standardized, a lot of evidence behind it. And there's a lot of evidence showing that the JES score correlates to practice. So people in practice, 2 huge, large, very definitive studies showed that clinicians in practice who score high on the JES survey, which demonstrates empathic awareness, get better outcomes than clinicians who score low on the JES survey. So that to me is like, oh, this is a potential tool to get my students at the level they need to be more impactful as clinicians. Doing that one, JES pre and post with the students, there was a statistically significant gain in levels of empathy. So it seemed to be onto something, obviously not definitive, but beginning of maybe a conversation around this. Reading the Mind and the Eyes Test, there was no change. I don't know if you're familiar with the Reading the Mind and Eyes Test. It's a very involved test. I'm not sure the students really took it seriously the second time. There's a lot of reasons for that. Didn't use that one the second time. It gets at different parts of empathy, maybe not so much clearly correlated with healthcare. So that's kind of what we did that first year. And we did it again in 2021, 2022. 21, 22, we're kind of putting together an article and the data on that one. 20, we've disseminated that. It's been published. What was unique about those 3 years was obviously COVID. 2020, if you want to remember, go back to that lovely time. It was really quite dramatic at the 7-week mark. Literally halfway through the semester, everything shut down. Everything went online instantly. So the first 7 weeks was pretty normal. Everything was in person that we did, all those discussions. The last 7 weeks was not. It was all online. Second year, 2021, in a lot of ways was even worse than 2020. It was hybrid, so we did all of the lectures, all of them were online. And anybody who knows about online teaching, especially those of us who are new to online teaching, the engagement was not there. Students were talking, doing whatever, not really any kind of participation, a lot of rolling absences with outbreaks of COVID. So it was a really difficult year to teach. And then last year, 2022, spring 2022, pretty much back to normal. Everything was in person. Really the first time we'd done a study, but everything was in person kind of teaching. So like I said, for 2020, we had a statistically significant gain, the JES, the Jefferson Empathy Scale. 2021, where everything was online, did not change, stayed the same. 2022, which everything was back to normal, everything was in person, it did. Again, it replicated the 2020 study and showed a statistically significant gain in JES scores on empathy. So it kind of shows something potentially about online teaching, at least the way I taught online, and effectively, apparently, potentially. But it's kind of showing something that this kind of emerging evidence here that maybe this is worth further study to go after these kind of different questions. Further study, I think, in maybe different classrooms with different healthcare clinicians, these same kind of narrative medicine concepts. Do we get the same kind of results kind of there? And then more so towards actual practice, kind of what we're trying to do with this 2023 study. Does it correlate when the clinicians go out on clinical rotations? Does it correlate more in terms of performance during simulations? Get at these kind of larger questions as we kind of move forward on this. So please, if you have questions about any of this, any of these parts, as I went through it quickly, I have lots of book examples if you're thinking about this, trying to wrap your head around this, and see the different material posted around case story versus case study. There's a posted list of narrative books which kind of hit some of these qualities that we're talking about. I'd love to talk to anybody about any of this. Looking if anybody wants to do a study on their particular class around stories and that sort of thing with healthcare clinicians. And thank you for listening.